Siúl a rís táimid í session poblí be ceantal amníanacha an bhuile an Ginevniu son le harda agus forbarta is scéal carbon fethe 30 a phléaghain. The meeting is resumed. We're in public session. We're going to discuss the outline heads of the Climate Action or Carbon Development Bill. Current fáiltear of in Yocht an Dr. Gallachóir lecture ineall teoracht funineh son Coláiste na Hallscoil Corcaigh. You're very welcome indeed, Mr. Gallachóir. Gaurav Mahagut Asfe Ilaharenu. I'm just going to go through a couple of procedural things. You've heard them already because of your presence in the gallery. But I wish to draw to your attention the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence that they give. If at any stage the committee instructs you not to give evidence and you continue to do so, you are then only entitled to a qualified privilege thereafter. You're directed that only evidence connected to the subject matter is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against persons or entities by name in such a way that identifies them or it. I also wish to advise you that your opening statement may be published on the website after proceedings have concluded. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they shouldn't comment on, nor criticise or make charges against persons outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make them identifiable. Any details again in terms of the website pertain here. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice of not commenting or criticising persons outside the House. Now, before commencing, Dr. Gallagher, we have your opening statement, so if you want to address us outside that and give us your thoughts around that, because the statement has been circulated, it's quite detailed and quite a good statement. So if you want to give views other than that, you're more than welcome to do that. And before commencing, just, we've already heard from Professor Kirby. This is a very important issue for us, and our overarching objective on the Joint Committee is to produce a report with a view to finessing the legislation, because we have obviously the heads of the bill at the moment, so we're very interested in terms of your exchange, your views, given your background, and how best we can advance our overall objective in that context. So if you'd like to give your opening address, you're very welcome to begin that now, and then we go to committee members for an engagement with you thereafter. Thank you, Dr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm delighted to address this committee. It's a very important topic, and it's also very urgent. What I propose to do is just summarise this opening statement that I've delivered. Now, the most recent assessment report from the IPCC concludes that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. That's their analysis as published in 2007. A more recent report just published last month from the International Energy Agency concludes that the world is not on track to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target that's been agreed as part of the international process on climate change negotiations, the Cancun agreements. What this means, according to the scientific analysis, is that we're going to have more extreme weather events. These will become more frequent and more intense, and I understand this committee has been addressing the impacts of flooding as a separate issue. Also, according to the International Energy Agency, where we're heading for is more likely to be in the region of a 3.6 to 5.3 degree Celsius temperature increase compared with pre-industrial levels. Now, essentially, this issue, the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with two things. What I call energy, which includes energy used for transport, for heating our homes and businesses and in industry, and for power generation. So energy on the one hand and agriculture on the other. And energy is at the heart of the challenge. The increase in emissions is largely due to what we've been doing in terms of energy, and it's also where the solutions lie. The focus of my own research is on energy modelling to inform policy decisions. We've built the only software model in Ireland that allows us to look at different scenarios in the period out to 2050. And it's on the basis of that and the analysis and the research that we've generated through that my comments come today. There are 5 key points that I would like to raise that will hopefully inform your deliberations. One is that Ireland has distinct challenges in transitioning to a low-carbon economy. That's not a recipe for advocating our responsibility, but it is a contextual point that we need to be aware of. Secondly, policy to date has been effective in isolated areas, but it has been insufficient. Thirdly, growth in beef and dairy farming is not aligned with developing a low-carbon economy. Fourthly, we should be ambitious and also realistic. And fifthly, we need more evidence-based policy. So in the context of the first point, Ireland has distinct challenges. There are two challenges I want to draw your attention to, and it touches on some of the comments that were raised earlier. One is that our emissions have grown while the EU emissions have declined since 1990. So when we talk about targets relative to 1990 and targets relative to 2005, we can have a very different perspective. The example I'll use here is that what was mentioned earlier, the EU Low Carbon Roadmap has a target for 40% emissions reduction EU-wide by 2030 relative to 1990 levels. That's equivalent to a 36% reduction relative to 2005 levels for the EU. But if we apply that to Ireland, a 40% reduction relative to 1990 levels, that's equivalent to a 52% reduction relative to 2005 levels. So if we simply apply the EU low carbon target for 2030 to Ireland, we end up in a very different situation compared with the rest of the EU. The second point in relation to our distinct challenges is the area of agriculture, which has come up already. Essentially, 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, whereas 10% come from agriculture EU-wide. This does not mean that we are bad at producing agriculture in terms of emissions. It reflects the fact that a significant portion of our agricultural output is exported, and the emissions are calculated based on production rather than consumption. So the fact that the cows are belching here means that they essentially contribute to our emissions, even though the steaks and the milk are consumed elsewhere. So about 80% of our beef and dairy sector output is exported. Now, that raises a key challenge, which I'll come back to. So they're the two contextual points. The second key point, policy to date has been effective in isolated areas, but it has been insufficient. And I used two examples in the paper that I submitted. One is the fact that we started more or less in the year 2000 to take wind energy deployment seriously, and we moved from a situation where wind energy represented 1% of our electricity generation in the year 2000 to 16% in the year 2011. That's a very significant achievement, and it was delivered through policy, largely the work of the Renewable Energy Strategy Group in 2000, which effectively transformed wind energy from a peripheral policy issue to one that achieved almost full stakeholder support. It's not to say that wind energy doesn't have challenges, but there's a success story there. The second one is in relation to the purchasing of new cars. We changed our car taxation system in July 2008, and now the emissions performance of new cars purchased in Ireland is significantly improved on what it was previously. Before 2008, effectively every kilometre travelled by car resulted in of the order of 166 grams of carbon dioxide, compared with now the weighted average for new cars is 130 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre. The thing is that these successes are in isolated areas, and looking at the energy system as a whole, that's where the problems arise, and that's where we have not been successful. There are areas of the energy system that we've neglected, and as a result, despite these successes, our energy system continues to be dominated by fossil fuels with high import dependency. So what we need is a plan for the full energy system. And when I talk about the full energy system, I mean energy used for power, for electricity, energy used for transport, and energy used in buildings. The third key point, growth in beef and dairy farming is not aligned with developing a low-carbon economy. This presents a huge challenge for us. As I mentioned earlier, our beef and dairy farming has a low carbon intensity, but we export a lot of output, so essentially we have a significant contribution to emissions from beef and dairy farming. So the decision Ireland has to take is, do we decide to stop beef and dairy farming in the context of moving to a low-carbon economy, or do we decide to keep beef and dairy farming in the context of moving to a low-carbon economy? If we stop it, the chances are the beef and dairy products will be produced elsewhere and result in greater emissions. If we don't stop it, a reasonable target for Ireland, in my view, I mean, we're working with Teagasc on this, but this is my own view from our analysis, that essentially a reasonable target for the agricultural sector would be to look at between 2020 and 2050 a zero growth in emissions from agriculture, which would allow for growth in agricultural activity coupled with improved performance in terms of emissions performance of agriculture. If we combine that with an 80% reduction in the remaining emissions, which are due to the emissions in the energy system, what we end up with is a target for 2050 of 50% below 1990 levels. Now, 50% doesn't sound ambitious in the context of 80 to 95% goals, but that's if we want to keep the beef and dairy sector going. And that ties into my 4th point. We should be ambitious and yet realistic. So the 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions comprising a 0% growth in agriculture relative to 2020 and projected levels in 2020, and an 80% reduction in the energy system related emissions relative to 1990 levels is ambitious, but also, in my view, would be a realistic challenge. We have done analysis where we explore the idea of the energy system going further. So the energy system achieving between 80 and 95% emissions reduction relative to 2050. And in that, we found that the marginal abatement cost, so that the cost to squeeze out the last ton of carbon dioxide in 2050 increases 5-fold when you move from an 80% to a 95% goal. The 5th and final point is that we need more evidence-based policy. Mitigation strategies for deep cuts in emissions require significant financial investment, and the development of strategies based on poor information and analysis will be expensive and wasteful. We need this for 2 reasons. One is to develop national policy in an informed, considered way, and secondly, to strengthen our negotiating position at EU level. And I cite one example there where our non-ETS target for Ireland, our research suggests it was based on flawed analysis, and that the costs of the misinformation, essentially we quantify it as approximating between 3 and 4 billion euros. Now, our negotiating effort at the time was diminished because we didn't have modelling tools such as the one we've developed, so it shows that, well, we have that tool now, so we can have more informed negotiating effort and hopefully negotiate a better result in the future. The last part of the opening statement is 8 recommendations, which are repeated from the paper that I submitted to the Oireachtas committee. Well, I don't propose to read them out now, just to allow time for discussion and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gallachóir. I'm going to ask Deputy Murphy to lead off. I'll switch it around. You're going to be here be at it for 2 weeks. Deputy Murphy.
Okay, thanks very much. Maybe I might ask you in the first instance, I mean, if we look at a country like New Zealand, for example, that is, pretty similar in terms of, well, it's a very agriculture-based country. It's a low-density population. Is there something we can compare their experience with ours in terms of the legislation, or would you like to comment on that? Because, I think that we're going to keep on coming back to the agricultural sector, because it's probably, well, it's not probably, it is our biggest challenge in terms of the sectors that we specifically have to address. And can I ask you if you see the obligations that we've signed up to, you know, under Kyoto and other international obligations, would you see those obligations as being the same as targets in terms of the production of legislation? Just in relation to the model you have in relation to the abatement costs, it seems a bit on the low side in terms of the cost in terms of GDP. I mean, are you satisfied that that model is robust? And might you comment on that? Have you done any modelling in terms of, or of course you've done modelling, but has your modelling corresponded with the possible costs, economic costs, if you like, of directly substituting the purchase of, you know, of carbon credits or whatever, whatever other vehicle that there might be? And do you have any idea of what that might be? Because clearly, if we could show that, there may well be an argument to invest in, for example, better public transport or something or other in terms of showing that it's actually cost neutral. The implications for Harvest 2020 to other sectors. I mean, obviously we're going to be on the increase in terms of our emissions in relation to Harvest 2020 if we were to achieve that. And I don't know if we. But what are the costs of the other sectors like transport and energy? They'll obviously have to pick up the slack on that if it's to in some way go towards neutralising it. You might comment on that as well, please.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. Dr. Gallachóir.
Okay, do I equate the Kyoto and other obligations with targets? I do. I mean, essentially, the Kyoto is an international agreement. We also have agreements or targets from the EU non-ETS burden sharing agreement. So I'd equate those with targets in that they're mandatory and they're imposed on Ireland. Well, once we subscribe to them and we agree with them, which we have done. So I would equate the two. I'm not familiar with the New Zealand legislation, but I would say that, I mean, my expertise is in energy, not in agriculture. So when I talk about agriculture, what I do look at is what are the consequences for the energy system of not being able to achieve targets in agriculture based on other people's analysis of what's feasible in agriculture. And that touches on the implications of Harvest 2020 in the short term. I mean, if we look at our short-term target, we have to get a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the non-ETS sectors relative to 2005 levels by 2020. The fact that Harvest 2020 is in place means, from our analysis, that the energy system will have to deliver more than 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the non-ETS sectors in energy. And the non-ETS sectors in energy are the most difficult ones to achieve reductions on. They're also the ones that we've neglected. We've had a focus on electricity in terms of energy policy. The electricity will not help us meet our non-ETS sector because it's part of the ETS grouping. So essentially, the heating of buildings, be it homes, buildings like this, shops, etc., and transportation are the key areas of the energy portion of non-ETS emissions. And because the Harvest 2020 has been agreed, and the consequence is that if the energy system delivers the overall reductions required to get that 20% reduction target, I think the cost, the marginal abatement cost, is something like 4 times higher than it would have been if the energy system, if the targets were allocated sectorally, if you like if everyone was had to give a 20% reduction. You mentioned the costs are on the low side vis-a-vis GDP. We've produced marginal abatement costs. We've also done it's quite a crude calculation in terms of the costs of meeting a target, and we've divided it by GDP. But I should say our model is driven by GDP activity, which produces the requirement for energy. When we start doing scenarios where we impose climate targets on our energy system, we don't currently have a feedback, so there's work in progress there. We're working with ESRI to try and improve that. So as you mentioned, the costs are on the low side. I think for our scenarios, we get something like of the order of 1 to 2% of GDP associated with our emissions reduction scenarios by 2050. But we do need to do further work to improve those results.
Can I just ask one thing? In terms of the assumption of GDP growth, I mean, obviously, development into the future, there's a resource implication anyway. So are you modelling the projected growth in GDP based on that? Or do you make any assumptions on what level of growth is sustainable?
No. What we do is, again, our focus is on the energy system. So we work with ESRI, who produce for us economic growth scenarios. And those growth scenarios are based on, I suppose, more on economic factors. So as I say, we are working on developing a feedback so that when we impose a climate target, we get some feedback mechanism to assess more robustly the impacts on the economy, but we don't have that yet.
Stanley.
So, I'd want to thank Brian for his presentation and coming in here today. Could I just ask you, in relation to, you say about significant ETS emission reductions may be achieved through electrification of heating and increased biofuel use in transport. Now, there's a number of possible collisions here. One of them that I see is obviously in relation to use of arable land for production of biofuel crops, and the need to harvest 2020, to increase production by 50% by 2020. To meet that, obviously is going to increase, or it's going to put increased pressure on arable land for that to be used for crops to be produced, for food crops to be produced, and of course alongside that there's the collision with trying to get agriculture, which is, according to Teagasc, is actually 32% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Trying to reduce that at the same time as trying to meet the Harvest 2020, and just how do you see that being reconciled? Now, I do know that we're actually slightly better than New Zealand, apparently in relation to agriculture. Only agriculture, according to Teagasc, agriculture in New Zealand has slightly higher emissions than agriculture here, but we have reduced by just over 17%. From the peak of 1998, so there possibly is ways that it can be further reduced. That's not just in relation to agriculture, but I just wonder how those contradictions, how you see those contradictions being met, and how that's going to play out. And just in the energy sector, one of the things that bothers me for a long time is the fact that we haven't even started to deal with hydropower. Despite the fact that we're a country that has significant amount of rainfalls, and we have a significant number of sites around the country where there is potential for hydropower, and indeed where in centuries gone by where there was hydropower. How do you see that being? I mean, in terms of public policy, that hasn't actually registered on the radar since 1928, since we built Ardnacrusha, and we just said that's grand now, we don't need to do anything else. But of course, there's a whole lot of potential small Ardnacrushas around the country. And how do you see that being kick-started? Because that's really, if that can be done, that is really a carbon-neutral way of producing energy. And just the last thing I wanted to mention was in relation to energy as well. The whole waste energy, apart from a few pilot projects that I would have visited too, I'm not aware of very many waste energy projects around the state. I mean, nothing significant has happened, or maybe I missed it. But I certainly haven't seen it happening. In fact, in landfills, at this minute, there are flares burning off gas, and it's not doing anything. It's just burning off the methane gas, which is it's mad, like, for want of a better term. It's mad what's happening with it. And I just think that we need to be, I think there's a huge shift in policies going to be happening, because we're going to have to target all those small sources. We can't replicate Ardna Crusha maybe 20 times over, or Paula Fuca, but what we can do is to have small sources out there, and we have left it to private enterprise, to a large extent, which hasn't really cut it for us. And how do you see that necessary shift in terms of, the same kind of national mission that you had, or Free State vision that we had in the 20s, in terms of, gearing up DSB, gearing up Ardna Crusha, gearing up Bordamona, etc., etc., etc. That type of mission is needed, I think, to start tapping into all those other sources of energy that are there, and which a lot of them, as I said, in the case of methane gas on landfills, that's actually been burnt off in a lot of cases.
Thank you, Deputy. And Dr.
Yeah, you've raised some interesting points there. Just the first one, there's a significant contradiction or conflict that I didn't bring up that you've raised there in terms of what we do about agriculture and the impact on the energy system. I mean, one of our sets of results shows that if we do keep the beef and dairy going and we want to meet more stringent targets, the energy system has to do more. Now, in order to do more, part of the solution there is bioenergy. And immediately then you get a conflict again with agriculture in terms of competition for land use. So that's another issue that we need to grapple with, and there's no easy answer to that. In terms of hydropower, we've actually exploited our best sites. So there are a number of small sites that could be exploited, but they wouldn't contribute a significant amount to our overall energy requirement. And just to look back on that, like Ardna Crusha, when it was developed, I mean, the grid was developed around Ardna Crusha. So at that time, we had effectively 100% of our electricity coming from renewables, coming from hydropower. Now we get about 2% of our electricity coming from hydropower. And electricity represents about less than 20% of our energy use. So it's a very small proportion. Our analysis would suggest that the biggest opportunity in terms of meeting our strong emissions reduction at least costs are associated with wind and bioenergy. And in the bioenergy space, biogas is an area that's been neglected. And you can anaerobically digest the organic fraction of waste to generate biogas, but you can also grow crops to generate biogas. And one of the best in terms of land use, in terms of energy output per unit per hectare of land is actually grass, which we have expertise in. So essentially we could see a situation where we're using grass as an input to anaerobic digesters to generate biogas. That biogas can then be fed into the national gas grid, and we could use that to meet our heating and transport requirements through the adoption of CNG vehicles. Now, there's some activity in this area happening in Ireland, but it's very slow, and like a lot of things in the energy space, it needs a significant boost if we're to make the transition that we require. The energy from waste, yeah, so the landfills, there's a number of the landfill sites, a number of the bigger ones do have electricity generation plants on them, but there are other ones that, as you say, are flared. Essentially, as I say, my view on energy from waste is that we look to generate biogas and feed that into the gas grid by upgrading it to biomethane.
Finish.
Firstly, Dr. Gallachóir, I just want to apologise that I missed the earlier part of your statement, and you may very well have addressed a couple of the points that I'm going to make. I just want to draw your attention to recommendation number 5, and if I can draw directly from a comment you make, it's the last sentence of that recommendation, and a quote, "Entering negotiations in Ireland's contribution to 2030 and 2050 EU targets for energy efficiency, renewable energy and climate mitigation, this modelling tool," I'm assuming you're referring to the Irish Times, is it? Modelling tool provides the capacity to improve our negotiating position. From that standpoint, can I deduce then from what you said there that putting unilateral targets into primary legislation is arguably less important than having an evidence-based approach to future negotiations on international targets and obligations as these processes evolve?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the UK, their approach in this regard, because they've legislated based on a target. They have then they have 5 yearly annual budgets, annual carbon budgets. 5 yearly carbon budgets, but annual reporting on those. So in that respect, they can take into account changes as they come and readjust their strategy to still aim to achieve the overall goal based on evidence. Yeah. And that's what I suggest would be very useful here, that we need, I mean, it was mentioned earlier to have sort of scientific input into advisory committees. I think a constant re-examining where we are and where we're heading towards will help us to make adjustments so that we don't develop a low carbon roadmap and then it's set in stone, that we can as things change, because technologies will change. I mean, we saw that with photovoltaic generation. You can have kind of significant changes that would need to be taken into account in order to do it in a more considered and efficient manner.
Senator McAfee.
Good morning, Pierre, and thank you very much, Pierre Gallachóir. Thanks for your presentation. As we proceed, it's going to be interesting to avoid a conflict between the energy sector and the agricultural sector. I think you've put it, you're putting it mildly in that there is a contradiction, I think, between the food harvest 2020 and the targets that we've set ourselves regarding reduction in emission. I just want to tease out how realistic is your suggestion, your ambitious, you say an ambitious but achievable goal of reducing by 50% the target by 2020. Not right, but actually doing that by zero growth in emissions in agriculture. How does that, have you either teased that out yourself or with fellow either social scientists or economists, or indeed agriculture economists, and how that might be achieved? What's the reality there, and how does that look? And then obviously the other huge challenge we have is to invest in our electrification and continued electrification, particularly in heat. And how do you see that being achieved in the short term? And because clearly it seems to me that government policy in terms of economic development, and particularly in the energy sector, is not aligned, is not in tune with the targets that are suggested in our EU targets. And finally, then, just on a philosophical level, you seem to be, say, a little bit more pragmatic than Father Kirby with regards to not being as aggressive about achieving a target within a certain time, but that there's a trajectory by which we will achieve it at a certain point. Just like your comment on that.
Mr. Gallachóir.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as you say, there's this contradiction, or this conflict, if you like, tension between what's happening in energy and agriculture, and it's on a number of fronts. If agriculture doesn't deliver, energy has to do more if we have an overarching target. If energy has to do more, it needs more land. So there's a feedback in terms of conflict. It's not an issue in the short term, I don't think, in terms of the time frame to 2020. I mean, there has been an analysis done of the land required for that and what land is left, if you like. It's more of an issue, I think, post 2020. But we need to be, obviously.
That would be short term, would it, like 2020? So beyond 2020 is where the issue rises, between 2020 and 2050.
Yes. Now, your second point in relation to this 50% by 2050 reduction relative to 1990 levels. like essentially some of the work we did before we looked at the EU low carbon roadmap, and they indicate that in the EU, you know, you can get a 50% reduction in agriculture emissions. So effectively, previously we applied, we're not experts in agriculture, so we just applied that to see what the consequences were for the energy system. And we concluded that if you could get 50% in agriculture and if you could get 95% reduction in the energy system, you'd be able to achieve the overall 80% goal. Now, from talking to people in Teagasc and other people who are experts in agriculture, achieving a 50% reduction in Ireland is not feasible because our agricultural makeup is very different to that EU-wide. Like the emissions are dominated in activities associated with grazing, whereas if you're doing things in terms of crops or where you've got, or if you've got animals housed, then there are other mitigation options available that we wouldn't have. So Teagasc are currently working on projections to 2050. So what we're using as a 0% is really just in the interim, you know, to a 0% target suggests that if agriculture wants to grow in terms of activity, it needs to find mitigation to be able to get a zero-sum game. So it's a very crude assumption. It's not based on evidence from agriculture, but clearly, if we want the beef and dairy sector to continue, it's in that kind of vein. I mean, obviously, if we choose as a country not to continue there, well, then we can have a different target. But what we wanted to do was, I mean, as I say, our focus is more on the energy system and how that 80% could be delivered in the energy system. In that regard, you mentioned the electrification of heat. Now, our model makes certain results come out of our model in the context of 2020 because we have to meet an ambitious non-ETS target because of food harvest. You've got all these knock-on effects. So as I mentioned, emissions generated in electricity are associated with ETS. So if we use electricity for heat or if we use electricity for transport, we're shifting them from the non-ETS to the ETS sector. And that's one of the options open to us. The electrification of heat, there's two things I'd say about that. One is we have about 1.6 million permanently occupied dwellings in Ireland, and nearly half of them are oil-fired. This is very unusual compared with EU member states. The amount of oil we use in our domestic dwellings was to do with the spread-out nature of our housing stock. And one of the things we could look at is, of those 700,000, how many of them are close to the natural gas grid? Because the sensible thing there would be to connect them up to natural gas in the short term. You have an efficiency improvement straight away, so you get emissions reduction associated with that. But in the long term, if you do have this biogas feeding into the gas grid, you have a route to renewable gas into the housing stock. And then for houses that are further, that are away from the gas grid, what we're looking at is attaching on an air source heat pump, so that you would have the energy would be drawn from the ambient air temperature, and with electricity then as the an electricity requirement. That's what we consider has been a sensible way of electrifying heat in the residential stock. So we're doing further analysis on that with other modelling tools that focus more closely on the power system on the one hand, and on housing residential energy use on the other, to see which houses might be, you know, because I mean you could have a strategy where you'd aim for larger houses, more inefficient houses, upgrade them first in terms of reducing their energy consumption, and then electrifying their heat use, to see what kind of incremental gains you could get from energy efficiency and electrification. So it's electrification of heat, but gasification of heat also, and that's often overlooked. Like in our most ambitious, in our 80% emissions reduction scenario for 2050, we do get electrification of heat and electrification of transport, but electricity increases from 20% of our energy use to 30%. So that means there's still 70% that's not electricity based. You know, it's largely biomass based. And then in some areas like aviation, we're still using kerosene. So it's electrification is only part of the story, but it's an important part.
One supplementary question, if I like. I don't know if you heard Paolo Kirby's response to the heads of the bill, and I'm not sure how aware you are of the bill itself, but his argument was, I'd just like to hear your view on this, particularly as you've now looked at both the agriculture, the energy, the natural resources. What, in your view, would be the natural department essentially responsible for delivering these targets? Or have you considered that?
I haven't considered it in detail, but I was listening to Paolo Kirby's presentation earlier, and I am conscious that given that you have different departments responsible for different parts of the emissions, if you like, and also different parts of the economy, it does seem to make sense that the Department of the Taoiseach be a place where it be housed as the overarching department with responsibility.
Senator Keane.
Thank you and welcome and thank you for your submissions, and I want to congratulate you on your IT tool that you have developed in Cork, and you will be able to read and have scientific based information on how we are changing and how we're performing up to 2050. The only thing is we want it now. Do you have anything for us? I know that obviously it's a long-term planning, but the climate is, you know, it's rising. Sea levels are rising by 3.2 millimetres. The climate is rising right throughout the Mediterranean area. Now, we're talking about agriculture and food production. Food security obviously is going to be important to the whole of the European Union as well. Now, if it is a thing that the scientists are, and what predictions are saying, that the Mediterranean countries will not be able to be as agricultural based as they are now even, that it will fall back on the prime agricultural producing countries to ensure that food security in Europe. Now, you mentioned as well there our land mass, and you know we've only a certain amount and we have to bargain, you know, balance one against the other. But if you look at a map of the ocean and what we own around our ocean mass is, what is it, 10 times the mass of our land mass. And I don't think probably we're not putting enough energy or effort into ocean-based wind production. Just we'll obviously have to be making recommendations, and obviously wind has gone up to 16% at the moment, the production from the low base of 1%. But if we are to ensure that we're going to reach our energy renewable targets that we would and should be, we'll have to make recommendations. Do you have to incentivize sea or ocean energy production and wind farms at sea? Because we have seen how difficult it is to get a wind farm off the ground when there's, you have to take in community considerations into consideration as well. Just on the, you said wind and cars are where we're, you know, getting more efficient, and the tax system on cars. Just a question on that. Only in the EU this week we saw that, you know, the efficiency of emissions from cars are reducing every single day. So hopefully we will get to the point soon where we have cars with zero emissions. Now, our tax base and income tax, cars tax is based on emissions at the moment. And just if you make a comment, if we're looking at to get money from somewhere to say we are going to put into renewable energy and wind energy, if you have a 1.5% of off the market selling price of a big car for people who can afford huge, big, whatever they are, diesel horsepower 550 costing about nearly 100,000, that they wouldn't miss a few bump, whereas because the Fiat Panda is getting more energy efficient and it's taxed higher. So I'm just a comment on when you said there your car is more efficient, it's just a thing that comes to mind. If we eventually reach zero emissions in cars, we'll obviously have no tax. On the anaerobic digestion, I think it's an area as well that I'd like to hear a lot more about, and the production from, and the capability that's there inherent in our land-based agriculture to ensure that we use more anaerobic digestion. It's not a subject, I think, at all. It's mentioned, there's in our policy document and the waste policy document, it gets a lot of mention, but I would like to see a recommendation coming from the scientists on how we could ensure that anaerobic digestion was a feature of a further feature. It is a feature, but not enough emphasis, I think, on it. So, as well as that, the issue you raised there about, the mapping system is fine, but yearly analysis of how we're coping, to make a recommendation on that. And I said to the last, when we were speaking previously, realistic targets are important, because it's fine saying we'd all love to reach it in, we say the 2020, but we're not, 2050 targets. The UK has 80%, I think, by 2050, and France has 75%. We don't have that, but if we got a realistic, from where we are now to where we could be in 2050, that we could make recommendations looking at, and I'll go back to realistic recommendations as well. Just the issue on which department it should be under. The Department, obviously, of the Environment, you would say, would be the obvious department, but because transport is so important, energy and energy is so important. Transport and energy are the two huge sectors. But the question, obviously, there's the advisory council, and to coordinate all the departments together. And
ask a couple of questions to be helpful for
yeah, would the expertise be in the Department of the Taoiseach, or you'd have to transfer all the expertise? At the moment, the climate change expertise, you could say, would be focused in the Department of the Environment. Would you have to transfer? You're not going to get more staff. Would you have to transfer them all out of the Department of the Environment and to have the expertise in the Department of the Taoiseach? And what would you do with the environment? And so you have to be realistic as well when you recommend that overall arching. Obviously, you'll have to pull it all together, but it would be where the expertise is that you will have to use it. And I want to thank you for your input, and we need more scientific information.
Thank you. There's a lot there. Firstly, in terms of, our model, as I said, has the capacity to focus on the long term, but we do analysis on the short term as well, because it is important, and I agree with you, that to keep a long-term perspective, but to have actions now in the short term. And we would make a number of specific recommendations in terms of incentivising renewable heat, incentivising anaerobic digestion and the generation of biogas for heat and transport. In terms of retrofitting of buildings, there's the point I made earlier about electrifying and gasifying residential homes. They're all short-term policy measures that can help us in the transition to long-term. You mentioned the ocean, and you're right, we have a very significant resource there, and our results do harness that in the form of particularly offshore wind energy. But effectively, the model adopts a least cost approach. So the model essentially will choose the onshore resources first because they're cheaper, but then will look to the offshore wind energy. And you're right, for it to happen, it does need policy support, or else it won't happen because it is more expensive. In terms of the cars, I thought it was actually disappointing that, we had a situation where there was some political lobbying at a European level to kind of dilute the improvements in car performance, or the targets for car performance. I don't see it as a problem in terms of tax revenue. You're right, we do generate revenue from tax, but if we have appropriate mechanisms and people change their purchasing decisions, and we have low tax associated with them, we will always find there are other areas. I think that the focus of tax should be on the more polluting. The higher the tax, the more polluting. So if we transition to a low carbon economy, we will find that there will be challenges in certain areas regarding revenue, but I would applaud and suggest that the government continue to differentiate and positively differentiate towards low emissions cars. Anaerobic digestion, I'd agree with you that there needs to be more happening. One of my colleagues in UCC, Jerry Murphy, has done a lot of research in this area. There is scientific evidence there. It doesn't currently have the policy support. In terms of realistic targets, I mean, that's where I thought setting a 0% for agriculture and an 80% for the energy system, resulting in an overall goal for Ireland of 50% emissions reduction by 2050. That's what I would consider to be a realistic goal if we want to keep the beef and dairy sector going. The Department of Taoiseach, you're right, the Department of Environment has the expertise. It's this difficulty between, I mean, you mentioned transport, energy, agriculture, of course, is the other one. I suppose the challenge is to find a mechanism by which it is coordinated, be it in Taoiseach's or be it in environment. Taoiseach's would have the overarching control element, if you like. Environment does have the expertise, as you point out. So I'm not fixed on one or the other, but both of those things need to be addressed. I think that's it.
Thank you. Deputy Coughlin-Kennedy. Thank you, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies for missing the earlier part of your presentation. I had another meeting. Just in relation to the challenges around the storing of energy. With wind energy, I think one of the challenges is to what happens when the wind drops and how do you store it? How do you see that being resolved? Because clearly we're going to have to rely to some extent on our existing means of generating energy with gas or some form of fossil fuel also. And I just would like your thoughts on that. And also in relation to, we were talking about incentivising renewable heat. Would radiant heating be where an aspect of that? And just in relation to the onshore generation of energy, there's a very big debate going on in the Midlands at the moment around the MOU that Ireland has signed with England. And I suppose whilst there has been quite a positive experience for a lot of communities in terms of wind generation in their area, I don't think that people are yet ready to make that leap, that the number of turbines that would be needed, where they're going to need to be located. I don't think the public have yet accepted that. And I just wonder, where do you see public information campaigns generating from? I mean, should it be coming from ourselves here in government? Should it be coming from universities? Should it be coming from the companies that are trying to develop? Because I see a big deficit there myself, just from my own experience at present.
Thank you. In relation to your first question, on storage, I suppose what we see is that, and I mentioned earlier, wind energy is a significant contribution in the future. But it's not the only thing that's there, and there are other options such as natural gas with carbon capture and storage, for example, or you can have coal with carbon capture and storage. And our analysis suggests that if we're going down that route as something to complement wind, because wind is variable, and also there's other issues with associated with inertia that are required, that so wind will need to be supplemented. And one of the options is to use the Kinsale gas field, the depleted Kinsale gas field, as a storage location for carbon dioxide, and to add on essentially carbon capture onto the new gas power plants in the Cork Harbour area. Storage is another option, and it's certainly part of the mix. Interconnection is another part of the option, because we can kind of benefit from, and this is like the Danes have benefited significantly from that in their development of wind energy. But I would make the point that, as I say, at the moment our electricity represents less than 20% of our energy use. And I think the policy debate, the focus of discussion in energy is dominated too much by electricity. Electricity is certainly an important part of the issue, but a bigger part of the issue is what do we do with transport and heating, which collectively represent over 80% of our energy use. I'm not quite sure what you meant by radiant heating, so you might come back on that. In terms of the Midlands wind, I mean, I mentioned wind as a success story. We haven't had the same experience as the UK in this regard, where they've had difficulties in developing onshore wind energy. They've had significant campaigns against wind energy, and as a result, they've had to move offshore more quickly, and this is partly where this Midlands project comes from, in that for the UK the option is to build wind offshore or import it directly from onshore wind in Ireland. I agree with you that the scale of the development is something new, the developments that are proposed, and it's unclear how that will be received in the heel of the hunt. One of the other issues with the Midland wind is that essentially if that wind energy has been used to meet the UK targets, at a certain point in the future we'll need it to meet our own, or if we don't, we might end up with more expensive wind energy. So I'm not sure in terms of the timing how long that contract will be negotiated for in the context of, as I say, our own needs. Certainly in the short term, it's envisaged that will be the amount of wind energy there will be surplus to what our power system can accommodate. But as that changes in time, that situation is likely to change. In terms of the public information, I think there are a number of areas where public information should come from, as you mentioned, the government, the universities. Also, in the energy space, of course, Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, the Energy Agency. Similarly, I mean, public information is also provided by the EirGrid, the transmission system operator. So there are certainly a number of sources where public information is and should continue to be provided from. Thank you.
Just to come back on the reading. Yeah, I was just reading about a particular type of heater that's being used in Europe, and it's called a radiant heater, and I'm not an expert in all this. I did ask somebody about it in SEAI because I thought, if we're looking at trying to get people to think differently about heating, but the point that was made was that because energy is too expensive here, that this type of heating, while it will be a good transition, a good type of heating to transition to, that it's not feasible at the moment. So I was just wondering if you. No, do you know the type of heating I'm talking about? There are a particular type of heater that apparently they're much better. It's much better for you, even health-wise, to use. Have you come across them before? Am I even explaining properly? No.
Sorry, I haven't.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Cotton Kennedy. Deputy Humphreys.
Brian, thank you very much. And certainly the documentation you sent in, I started learning about I thought the Irish Times is what we got every day, not a measurement thing. But first of all, Brian, you introduced something there which is relatively new to me, and it's been discussed in England quite a lot. In the UK was the carbon capture model, where they were talking about the North Sea being a carbon sink for them. So is the Kinsale gas field, when it runs out, a possibility of a significant carbon sink for Ireland?
Yes.
It is. And have you done the figures and modelling on that?
We have. It's essentially work in progress, but what we've been looking at is utilising it to. I mean, there have been some recent natural gas-fired power stations built in Cork, in the Cork Harbour area, which would be. Essentially, they'd have a high efficiency relative to a lot of the power plants on the system, and the idea would be to take the carbon dioxide from them, capture it, and pump it into the Kinsale gas field. Now, there's different parts of the Kinsale gas field, and what we're looking at is precisely what you're talking about, what the scale in terms of how many years we could do that for, also what the engineering challenges are associated with that. And obviously you'd want to make sure that if it is stored there, it doesn't seep out, you know, that it is actually sequestered. So it's very much work in progress, but essentially it's to try and address this question, like what in the power system, if wind energy is there, what will be complementing it in the future? And natural gas CCS is one of the options. Biomass is another, of course. But this brings back to our land use question about if we have more biomass for power, should we use biomass for power generation? Should we use it for heat? Should we use it for transport? How much land should we allocate for biomass? And if there is a constraint on the land use, what's the most effective way of using that biomass? So we're considering a number of options. And at the moment in our model, we don't have biomass CCS as a technology because coal CCS and natural gas CCS are a much more developed, albeit stalled, stage of development. But a biomass CCS would give us the prospect of having negative emissions, which is would be a very nice scenario to move towards.
You haven't done the modelling yet, what kind of percentage impact that would have on, you know, on reaching kind of targets?
Well, we're looking at...
You're talking, the signs change all the time, so it's, I know, probably difficult.
Well, essentially we're looking at, I mean, like EirGrid are looking at the idea of wind energy on an instantaneous basis, trying to move towards being able to accommodate 70% wind energy on an instantaneous basis. So we're looking at it in that context, like the remaining 30%, if you like, on an instantaneous basis. What does that mean in 2050? Depending on the scenarios regarding electrification, it will be more or less. And then the consequence of that in terms of the what's feasible. I mean, obviously that's just one example, the Kinsale gas field. But what's the? It looks like the most promising. There's been like SEAI and EPA have done some studies on sites for carbon capture and storage around the country, and that one looks to be the most promising. But that's a very early stage result, as I say.
Just going back on the heads of bills in the place of the target, like one target that's in the heads of bill, and you touched on it, is the 20% reduction on emissions from 2005 for 2020, basically the Gaeltacht agreement. Have you done any modelling on the hitting of the first target, if you want to call it? That's in the heads of bill.
Do you mean on this 20%?
Yeah, reduction on the 2005 figure.
Yes, we have.
And you know, how far off are we, or have you figures on that?
Well, what we come at it a different way, in the sense that we look at the target, we impose it, we see what's required to deliver it, and comparing that to where we're heading, we are far away from it. Our model would suggest that we need, and it's, as I said earlier, it's particularly in these areas of heat and transport, because our focus has been on electricity in the policy space. So we do get electrification of heat, which helps, but the remainder of the requirements relate to improving energy efficiency in buildings, using biogas and biomass for heating, and increased use of bioenergy in our transport system. So it's quite different from the trajectory we're currently on.
And you mentioned there, like in your paper, that when you're actually trying to get it moving towards reductions, you should sometimes get short-term increases in emissions as you move in that direction. You said it there a few minutes ago. I'm just wondering, do you think it's still viable for us to hit the 2020 target?
Well, all of the national projections show us falling short of the target, and the national projections take into account things that we have on the we have committed to in terms of things like renewable energy targets, but some of which don't have policies associated with them. So to meet the national projections is already a challenge. To go beyond that and meet the 2020 target is a more significant challenge. So from where we are today, no, I don't think we're going to meet that 2020 target. I think we can meet it, but it requires a significant increase in a policy focus.
And just where the figures change, because within the bill, we're going to tie ourselves, well, we do tie ourselves to anything that's negotiated in 2015 for the 2030. And we switched them from a figure of emissions reduction from 2005 as 20%. We shift back to the 1990 figure. And you just said there, you're talking about if it would jump for us as a 52% reduction. So there's those figures are right. So there'll be an extremely steep curve going with this heads of bill.
Before I go any further, I'm going to let Deputy Murphy and Deputy Nash ask a final question. Deputy Coughlin has a point of clarification, and then the response.
Yeah, it's just associated with the question that's been asked. I mean, missing the 2020, I can't see how we're going to make them, but the 2020 targets, if we miss them, obviously it becomes much more challenging then, because we're playing catch up to get to 2030. Are there things that we could address in the legislation, or are there things that we could put in the legislation, not just for the 2020 targets, but to improve the prospects of getting to 2030, that you would specifically highlight?
Deputy Nash.
Yeah, again, on a related point, just for the record, you might clarify the situation pertaining to targets on our, as you might see it, our kind of inability to meet those under current circumstances. Can I assume what you're saying is that obviously we have less chance of meeting those targets in the absence of legislation, and at least when the legislation and the sectoral roadmaps are introduced, that we have a better chance of meeting them? Can you just clarify that, please, Dr. Gallagher?
Yes, just in relation to the radiant heaters, it's infrared heaters is what they're known as well.
Mr. Gallagher.
Well, I haven't come across those, I'm sorry.
Well, apparently there's 70% energy savings, so they're worth checking out.
Pitch anyway. Well done. Mr. Gallagher to conclude. Yeah.
But we do, I mean, it does raise a good point, though, that we do need, I mean, the size of the challenge is such that we need everything we can get. The other thing is, and sometimes the discussions can be problematic in that regard, there are no silver bullets. This is another, so sometimes we tend to focus on individual technologies, and that's been the problem. Like, as I said, in policy we've been successful in certain areas, but we've missed the bigger picture. In terms of legislating for 2020, I mean, the 2020 target is already legally binding because it's part of an EU legally binding agreement. So we have a legally binding target and we're not on track to meet it. Going back to your question, what can we do in the legislation to improve the prospects of getting to 2030 targets? It requires a firmed up commitment. I mean, we have these targets. We need a policy that looks at the whole picture and makes sure that the individual elements add up. If they don't add up, we're not going to meet the target, and that's where we're currently at. If they do add up, or if we look for where the gaps are and change things so that they add up, then we've a better chance of meeting the targets. So do we have a less chance in the absence of firm targets? Yes, I think. I think the targets provide a very useful goal in aiming for something. We need a roadmap to show us how to get there, but which comes first, to my mind, is less important in the sense that if we develop a roadmap, then we have a target that comes out at the end of that, and we're aiming for that. or if we start with a target and develop a roadmap. But we need both, essentially.
Okay, current session there listen session shot. Bottom and wake us all done Dr. Gallachóir as an gunov hugshin done enough. Tan Quinn Corral Loco the Hinisha Coin and Kogel Ul Fehe 3 dig, no to small meat egg a de a clog and modern. For a meal.